Bans. Nothing says we totally lost control of the situation, like declaring something illegal and praying everyone forgets it existed. Medieval authorities loved to ban things. Hats, shoes, sex, the wrong shade of purple. But when they banned a weapon, that meant it worked too well. It was too good at snapping necks, gutting knights, or inciting peasants to forget their place. These weren't weapons of war, they were weapons of panic. Take the godendag. Sounds friendly, right? Good day in Dutch. Well, good day to your face, which it's about to cave in. It looked like a club with a spike glued on top, like a candied apple of pure spite. Bruges, 1302. The good citizens aren't waiting for the French to knock. They ambush the garrison at night, armed with these peasant-friendly horror sticks. One end smashes, the other stabs. That's efficiency. The French knights never stood a chance, pulled off their horses, armor cracked like walnuts. Chronicler Guillaume de Nangis called it a great cruelty. The local authorities called it illegal. The minute the dust settled, the message was clear. Uprisings are messy. But giving the lower classes a weapon designed to unhorse nobility, that was just impolite. Or take the crossbow, the medieval version of putting a gun in the hands of someone who'd never trained a day in their life. By 1279, the Second Council of the Lateran had seen enough. Pope Innocent II declared crossbows forbidden against Christians, not heathens, Christians. Apparently, perforating a Saracen was still fine. The logic was simple. Crossbows made killing too easy. No chivalry, no glory. Just a click and a corpse. You could train an idiot in a week, point him at a duke, and poof, feudal hierarchy goes up in a puff of bolt smoke. Bows required strength, lineage, romance. Crossbows required fingers. You can see why the church got nervous. Then there's the misericord, the mercy giver, which, like most medieval euphemisms, is a lie wrapped in steel. This was the knife you drove between someone's ribs after the real fight was over. Knights carried them as a finishing touch, a slender, stiletto-shaped reminder that mercy sometimes wears a sharp suit. Technically, it was for delivering a mercy stroke to the mortally wounded. Realistically, you used it when someone was inconveniently still breathing. It was long enough to slide through the eye slit of a helmet, but not so long it couldn't be hidden. Cities like Florence and Paris began outlawing them not because they were brutal, but because they were quiet. Too many unexplained deaths, too few heroic duels. Authorities liked their violence loud, public, and taxable. The misericord was none of those things. Speaking of quiet violence, let's talk garrots. Not technically a weapon of war, but deeply popular in taverns, prisons, and anywhere someone needed to stop breathing without alerting the neighbors. In Valencia, by the late 14th century, there were actual ordinances banning silk cords over a certain thickness because they weren't for fashion. They were for murder. The Spanish even professionalized it. The garrote became a method of execution by the 17th century, complete with a chair and a screw mechanism. But in the street-level medieval underworld, it was the strangler's best friend. Silent, intimate, and very hard to defend against when you're already drunk. Cities started cracking down not because they cared about your life, but because it made solving murders hellishly inconvenient. But let's not forget the Morning Star, the medieval answer to the question, what if a flail had feelings? It's a spiked ball, attached either directly to a handle or swinging from a chain. Either way, it was chaos on a stick. You didn't aim a Morning Star, you unleashed it. A well-timed swing could crush a helmet, break bone, or turn a shield into an abstract sculpture. The church frowned on it, not because it was unholy, but because it was indiscriminate. Anyone could wield one, and its damage wasn't clean. No elegant swordplay here, just mashed meat in armor. Laws in places like Augsburg and Bern put restrictions on owning or carrying them in town, especially during festivals or feast days. The concern wasn't foreign invaders. It was each other. After a few drunken saints' days ended in blood puddles, the message became clear. Leave your medieval blender at home. And now, for the granddaddy of overkill, Greek fire. Okay, yes, technically that's Byzantine, but don't get huffy. The medieval period doesn't stop at the Alps. Greek fire was the medieval napalm, a chemical cocktail that burned on water and clung to flesh like gossip in a monastery. The formula was state secret. We're talking top tier, classified. Soldiers who handled it didn't always know what they were using. Chronicles from the siege of Constantinople describe enemy ships erupting like candles, sailors screaming as the sea caught fire. You don't outlaw something that brutal unless it becomes a liability. The Byzantines didn't ban it outright, they just made using it outside imperial control a treasonable offense. For good reason. If your enemies could steal it, you were basically handing them the keys to the apocalypse. So yes, some weapons were banned because they were sneaky, others because they were too democratic, but mostly they were banned because they worked too well and in the wrong hands. You see, in the medieval world, violence was never just about winning. It was about permission. Who gets to kill, how, and why. A sword in a knight's hand was honor. That same blade in a butcher's grip, that was murder. The line between war and crime wasn't drawn in blood, it was drawn in status. So when a weapon blurred that line, when it made death cheap, portable, and efficient, the powers that be did the only thing they could. They banned it and prayed you didn't notice how many were still in circulation. Let's step off the battlefield and into the alley. Because if you really want to understand what medieval people feared, look at what they banned inside. The walls not on the front lines. The city was a pressure cooker. Packed streets, open sewers, too much religion, not enough bread. And every cobbler, smith, or drunk had access to iron. Which brings us to the basilard, a dagger so suspicious it got its own set of laws. The basilard was a Swiss invention, long and double-edged, stylish, deadly, the kind of weapon that said, yes, I pay my taxes, but I will also gut you over a spilled beer. In 14th century London, the mayor outright banned its sale to civilians. Florence followed suit. The weapon sin? It was both fashionable and lethal. A status symbol among the wrong class of people. Young men were wearing them like jewelry, only instead of impressing girls, they were opening arteries. By the late 1300s, some cities passed ordinances that literally described how many inches of blade you could carry. Anything bigger got you fined or arrested. Think TSA, but with more plague and less paperwork. The real concern wasn't the weapon itself, it was who it enabled. A dagger like that let a tailor kill a knight. It bypassed chainmail if you knew where to stab. And the authorities knew a city was one bad harvest away from turning into a powder keg. Armed apprentices were like armed toddlers, loud, irrational, and ready to set something on fire. And speaking of irrational toddlers with weapons, let's talk about slings. Yes, slings. Not just for biblical shepherds or unruly children. These things were terrifying in trained hands. A well-thrown sling stone could crack a skull at 100 paces, and good slingers had sniper-level accuracy. Roman sources respected them. Medieval armies feared them. But slings were cheap, too cheap. You could make one from wool, leather, or flax. Stones were free. Training? You just needed time and boredom, something peasants had in bulk. In 13th century France, there were bans on practicing with slings near city walls, not because of accidents, but because local boys had gotten too good. They could knock out sentries, harass nobles, and disappear into the alleys. A gang of teenagers with slings was essentially a roving anti-authority militia. The weapon was banned not out of chivalry, but logistics. You can't rule a town where the baker's kid can take out your tax collector from 3 rooftops away. And here's where things get dark. Because for all the rules and rituals of civilized combat, the most frightening weapons were the ones used by people with nothing to lose. Which brings us to the handguns, the proto-guns of the 14th century. Crude, smoky, loud. Imagine a metal tube packed with powder, nailed to a stick, lit with a match, and aimed in the general direction of your enemy's hope. That was a handgun. Now, early firearms were temperamental. Half the time they exploded in your face. But when they worked, absolute terror. The sound alone shattered morale. You couldn't parry a bullet. Armor didn't help. And anyone could use it. Anyone. In the hands of mercenaries, they were scary. In the hands of civilians, governments started sweating. So bans came fast. In the German town of Speyer, records from 1363 show restrictions on private citizens owning any weapon with fire or powder. Similar laws popped up across the Holy Roman Empire. It wasn't about safety, it was about control. The feudal system depended on slow, predictable violence. Firearms introduced chaos. You couldn't duel with a gun. You couldn't negotiate after a shot to the chest. Even worse, you couldn't glorify it. No songs about brave knights getting half their torso blown off by some farmer's cousin. It didn't fit the narrative. So authorities did what they always did when the tools of violence slipped out of their grip. They cracked down and hoped no one figured out how easy gunpowder was to make. Of course, sometimes the most dangerous weapon wasn't the flashiest. Sometimes it was just disgusting. Let me introduce you to the butcher's hooks. Not a metaphor. Actual iron hooks used in meat markets by day, street brawls by night. In 14th century Cologne, city records list multiple injuries caused by meat hooks repurposed in street quarrels. You grab someone by the ribs, the cheek, or worse, the groin. You pull. You don't need a sword when you can drag someone through a crowd like a sack of meat. Authorities began prohibiting butchers from wearing their work tools outside designated zones. Not because they feared knives, but because they feared organized butchers. You see, guilds weren't just trade associations. They were gangs with offices. Butchers were especially feared. They handled blood daily. They knew how to kill fast. And if they got angry, they could mobilize 50 large men with cleavers in minutes. So banning their tools outside the market was less about peacekeeping and more about neutralizing an occupational militia before it started flexing muscle in city politics. And then there's the holy water sprinkler. Sweet name, right? Sounds churchy. It wasn't. It was a mace, a flanged club designed to crush armor. And yes, it was called a holy water sprinkler because it sprinkled brains across the battlefield. Variants of it were so effective that in Hungary and Poland, some versions were banned from civilian ownership by the mid-15th century. The problem wasn't just that they were brutal. It was that they required no skill. Swordplay took training. Archery needed discipline. But a mace? Just swing until something cracks. In some towns, ordinances banned hidden maces versions, disguised in canes, or carried under cloaks. Because nothing says social unrest like a tavern full of drunk men holding priest killers under their robes. The church didn't appreciate the irony either. But here's the twist. For every weapon that got banned, 100 more slipped through the cracks. Hidden, repurposed, renamed. Because violence isn't just about blades and balls and hooks. It's about intent. And no law, no ordinance, no papal decree could keep desperation from sharpening whatever was at hand. The most dangerous weapon in the medieval world? It wasn't the morning star, or the crossbow, or even the fire-belching handgun. It was the human mind backed into a corner, denied a voice, and handed a tool. And that is what terrified the people in power. But if you want to see true terror in the eyes of authority, you don't need to look at armies. You need to look at farmers. Because the most unsettling thing in the medieval world wasn't a knight in full plate or a siege engine on the horizon. It was a plowman who figured out that a scythe swings just as well through ribs as it does through wheat. Enter the war scythe. No, not the sleek, curved fantasy weapon. The real one. It wasn't forged for war. It was converted. A tool, twisted into a blade. The peasants of Bohemia figured this out during the Hussite Wars in the early 15th century. Facing armies of armored knights and professional killers, they grabbed what they had, grain scythes, and reforged them. Turned the blade upright. reinforced the shaft. Suddenly, they had reach, force, and a brutal cutting edge. They didn't need lords. They had leverage. Jan Žižka, the one-eyed general who led the Hussites, weaponized that desperation. His armies were mostly farmers and craftsmen, armed with scythes, flails, and repurposed tools. And they won, repeatedly. Against trained crusaders, Prague banned the civilian manufacture of such weapons within years. Authorities across Central Europe began regulating even the possession of modified tools, because the war scythe wasn't just a blade, it was a symbol, a reminder that if you push the common folk far enough, they won't write a petition, they'll weld one. And nothing makes a bishop sweat faster than the smell of forge smoke in a peasant village. Speaking of forges and anxiety, let's talk spring-loaded traps. Now, this one's a bit of an outlier. Not a battlefield weapon, not even something you'd carry. But in parts of late medieval Italy, particularly Tuscany, there were bans on rigging mechanical traps in private homes and businesses. Why? Because people were doing it. Crossbows mounted behind doors, weighted clubs triggered by tripwire, acid flasks on a tilt hinge. Think medieval Home Alone, but replace Macaulay Culkin with a deeply paranoid tanner and Joe Pesci with the city tax collector. In 1395, Florence passed ordinances against mechanical devices intended to harm unwelcome entrants. They didn't ban them because they were ineffective, they banned them because they worked too well. And because the people who used them weren't nobles with lands. They were artisans, tradesmen, people defending workshops, not castles. The real threat wasn't the trap. It was the idea that safety could be DIY, that you didn't need a lord or a militia, just a tripwire and some creativity. Let's go back outside. It's a market day. The square is loud, messy, tense, and there, beneath the chaos, you spot someone carrying a lead-weighted cudgel, maybe wrapped in leather, maybe studded with nails. Officially, it's a walking stick. Unofficially, it's a brain masher. Cities like York, Milan, and Bruges had repeat issues with these accidental weapons. So laws appeared not just against carrying them, but against hiding them. Because the cudgel was the medieval version of concealed carry. And worse, it was affordable. Iron was expensive. Lead, cheap. Blunt force, very democratic. The cudgel's crime wasn't sophistication. It was availability. The elite had fencing masters and chainmail. The poor had physics. And the cudgel obeyed the only law that mattered in a bar fight. Whoever hits first wins. Bans rarely worked. Men kept carrying them, hidden in cloaks, under belts, even sewn into sleeves. The weapon wasn't going away, but the bans weren't really about stopping violence. They were about telling people which kind of violence was allowed, and which wasn't. Now, for a weapon so absurd, so terrifyingly efficient, it got banned more than once, and keeps resurfacing in every dark alley of history. The man-catcher. Yes, it sounds like a dating app for mercenaries, but this was real. A polearm with a semicircular pronged head designed not to kill, but to grab, usually a metal collar with inward spikes. The idea? Catch someone by the neck or limbs, yank them off a horse or out of a crowd, take them alive. It was popular in riot control, noble kidnappings, and prisoner retrieval. German city guards used them in the 15th century. So did castle defenders. But eventually, authorities got squeamish. The spikes weren't just restraining, they were maiming, and when used in the street, they became execution by slow strangulation. Some municipalities banned their use by non-military personnel. Others limited them to lawful arrest situations. Because once people started making homemade versions, with pitchforks and butcher hooks welded to broom handles, things got ugly, quickly. This wasn't a battlefield weapon, this was a statement. You don't kill someone with a man-catcher. You publicly humiliate them, drag them, parade them, let the crowd spit. That's why it was banned. It turned justice into theater. And in the medieval world, if anyone was going to run that show, it had to be the state. Because make no mistake, these bans weren't about morality, they were about monopoly. The crown, the church, the city council, they all wanted to control who got to break skulls and when. Every banned weapon was a crack in the armor of that monopoly, a glitch in the system, a moment where power flipped. And in a world where violence was currency, flipping that power was the closest thing to revolution. You see, for all the pageantry, the prayers, the parchments with wax seals, medieval society ran on threat. Nobles threatened peasants, kings threatened nobles. The church threatened everyone. It was a pyramid built out of fear. And weapons, real, usable, blood-slick weapons, were the chisel that cracked the foundation. So when they banned a weapon, it wasn't because it was evil. It was because it worked too well for the wrong people. A crossbow in a bishop's hand? Divine providence. A crossbow in a peasant's? That's treason. A mace on a knight's belt? Authority. A mace under a miller's cloak? Murder. Same weapon. Different verdict. The difference was always who held it. And maybe, just maybe, that's the part that still echoes. Because today, we like to think we're past all that. We have laws, courts, ethics committees, but scratch the surface of modern power, and you'll still find the same logic. Who gets to use force? Who gets to defend themselves? Who gets to win? And who's not allowed to even try? They don't ban the thing because it's dangerous. They ban it because you might be. And if that doesn't feel a little medieval, well, good day to you.